thank you for coming, or for staying in the same place as you are, as we all do in this strange world we're in, but talking about it. So do you want to tell us about yourselves?
Maybe I can introduce Paul.
Yeah, and Paul can introduce you.
Paul really is an artist commissioned to do mind-blowing pieces, certainly, that require an enormous amount of labor and dedication. And I've known Paul for some time now, in part because we shared an office as lecturers in a university around London. And he's got a background in clinical psychology and an interest in psychoanalysis. And a few years ago, on my way to a meeting at Oxford to hear and discuss with Lambros Malaforos, Paul decided to join me. And we had a lovely ride on the train there and a lovely time in Oxford. And from that moment on, I guess, Paul got very interested in material engagement theory. And I could understand why, in part because on his website, I remember reading that sometimes Clay thought for him. And I thought, what an interesting idea, what an interesting way of putting it. And for the past few years, and certainly through his art, as well as through his work for his DPhil at Oxford, under the supervision of Lambros Malaforos, we've had the opportunity to write together on creativity, on material engagement, and on outside.
Paul, would you like to introduce Fred?
Yes, so I was just about to introduce myself. I'm Paul March, and I'm going to introduce Fred Vallée-Tourangeau, who, as he said, we met many years ago when I came to my office at the University of Hertfordshire to find someone else in there. It was an office that was just for me, and suddenly Fred sitting at a desk that saying, in a much more Canadian accent than he has now, which I won't try, "Good morning." And I was completely gobsmacked because no one had warned me that I was about to share an office. So I immediately took against him. And things got better pretty quickly. But he, we introduced ourselves. We told each other a bit about work. I was a bit of a fish out of water because this was quite a cognitive and behavioural department, and I was very interested in psychoanalysis. And Fred was, seemed to be at the extreme end of cognitive psychology. And what amazed me was that, first of all, he read storybooks as well, and seemed to have a sort of voracious appetite for novels, but also seemed to know about other stuff as well. And the breadth of his knowledge was extraordinary. So we were quite disciplined in the office, and we would work, but occasionally we would allow ourselves to talk to each other. And those were by far the best bits of the day. And do you remember this, Fred? And then for various reasons, partly to do with Fred moving continent and then moving back and then sort of disappearing, we lost contact for quite a while. And then I started becoming interested in that things just happened without me really deciding what were going to happen in my workshop. And I learnt that this was called distributed cognition. And so I did a Google search on distributed cognition and found that Fred had edited a book on it. And I was completely astonished by it, because this wasn't really his area when we last talked about his work. So I contacted him after, I don't know, what was it, 5 years maybe, something like that. And a match had already been made in heaven some years ago, but it got broken by the machinations of hell. And then we remade the match, which hopefully will continue. What else can I say? I depend on Fred to scaffold, and I don't really want to use the word challenge, because I don't experience it as challenging, but there's something about having Fred reading alongside me, similar things to me, sending me stuff that gives me some confidence that about the validity of what we're doing that I certainly otherwise wouldn't have. In fact, I think I would think that I was a complete madman. So there we go. That's Fred.
Oh, that's very sweet.
So, and maybe I should present myself just very quickly. So my name is Vlad Glaveanu. I am head of psychology at Webster University Geneva, directing the Creativity and Innovation Center, and I'm the founder of the Possibility Studies Network, and very excited about the topic.
I'm Wendy Ross. I'm a senior lecturer at London Metropolitan University, and I am interested in the role of material agency and uncertainty and how we navigate that through the lens of serendipity and possibility thinking. And the possible. So obviously that's partly what we're here to talk about, and the possible and possibility thinking and those sort of things. Do you think, I mean, obviously we've asked you to think about it. Do you see how the notion of the possible, the notion of what is possible, or how this idea of stretching out into the possible might inform the work you do? I know you both actually do very different work on the surface, although it's informed by a really similar and aligned theoretical background. Obviously, Fred, as you indicated, Paul, is an experimental psychologist at heart, and you're an artist, so the work that you do is very different. Do you think that the notion of the possible informs your work, and if so, how?
Well, the easiest way that I can conceptualize it is what is just about to happen, and the extent to which what is just about to happen is predicated by what is happening and what has happened in the past, and that moving away from, which I think, you know, the four of us have had many conversations in different contexts, particularly and maybe importantly a reading group that we have once a month. So we have regular chances to swap stories and ideas, and I think we share a platform which I bet you can do, and you know, we're not afraid to disagree with each other either, so I'm sure you'll disagree with me if I misrepresent what we all have in common. But this is what I'm going to suggest we all have in common, is the idea that we move away from thinking of what's called the mind, and let's talk about the mind in an extended way as a place where things happen, towards a thread of events or a network of events that coalesce together. And so going back to in terms of what is just about to happen, then that's a sort of node along this network of events, and as it happens, events in the past fall away because they turn out not to be relevant, and events in the future collect on the horizon because they turn out that they are going to be relevant, but they won't all come to pass. But there's suddenly a sort of, as each moment moves, there's a sort of sorting of possibilities, and that arrange themselves, and then as you move through them, some fall away and other possibilities arise. So that's the way I would conceptualize it.
I mean, I think what attracts me to the possible is maybe also a set of maybe conflicting or even contradicting ideas. I recently came across a statement, a very sort of a brute aphorism that simply said the possible is an illusion. And I thought, well, that's okay. We could use illusions sometimes, but I think the point of that statement was that it remains an illusion until it is maybe actualized, but more in terms of looking at the medium or media in which ideas are formulated. So there's a physicality to the enactment of the possible. And from my perspective as a psychologist interested in the so-called origin of new ideas, it's very much then this articulation in a physical medium. I mean, you can think, of course, an idea in the brain. Certainly there's no idea that floats in zero gravity. There's no such thing as sort of a frictionless environment in which ideas kind of float about. So ideas, even in the brain, are, I guess, supported by a neural network of sorts. And I guess if you're a really hardcore neuroscientist, you could map out the colorful images that correspond to that neural activity. But really, by the material medium, I mean the words, the physical words that are written or typewritten on a machine or written in your nice moleskin book. The very articulation of the idea, what I find fascinating is the articulation of the idea also shapes it. So the possible is illusory, in part because when the possible is enacted, it's no longer the possible as you had imagined it. So as soon as you change medium, as soon as you transport it from one medium to the other, the very transportation both entails cost. From a psychological perspective, I think these costs are quite interesting. It's interesting to map them, to properly understand how the possible is translated into, I guess, an actuality of sorts. And from a psychological perspective, I think that what gets woven then in the translation or in the transportation of the idea across these media over time is an interesting, deserves our attention. Certainly deserves mine, certainly. I'm also, I find it extremely seductive, this kind of ontological instability that whatever, the possible may represent. And it's nearly the same kind of fascination or interest that I get when I watch sort of either utopic or dystopic futures, sci-fi movies. I just think it's interesting to see how that's articulated, how that's conveyed, and so forth. And I think I sometimes reflect. Well, certainly Paul, when I read Paul's case studies, for example, on the works of art that he's produced, and I really get a sense of how the possible is woven through these objects, these intermediate or interim objects that he creates a long time. And I think when I reflect on, in a much more parochial, pedestrian, small-scale way about writing an essay, or indeed preparing a presentation, or indeed preparing a lecture, how there's an interesting process by which the possible gets woven over time by the manipulation of these objects through these different media. That was a long answer. Sorry.
It was excellent. Actually, I was just thinking here how we come to the topic from different points or different angles. Both of you are very interested in materiality. I'm certainly very interested in that as well. But I came from a social perspective. So in that sense, my first encounter with the possible was through all the literature on social change, on utopias, dystopias. And in a way, this is the possible with a capital P. It's really that future, in many ways, the future, although the possible is not only the future, but in many ways that big difference, big change that could be around the corner, probably will never be. And it's always kind of tempting, but we never fully get there. But when you look at things from a material perspective and from a microgenetic moment-to-moment type of analytical lens, that is exactly how both of you talked about, the adjacent possible, in a way, what Paul was mentioning in a micro level, all this interwoven idea between the actual and the possible. And I'm really fascinated, and thanks, Fred, for reminding me of this idea of the illusion of the possible. In many ways, just like we only have the present, and the past is in recollection and the future is not yet here, in a way, we only have the actual. And yet, if we didn't have the possible as a category and as a possibility, if you may, we wouldn't have the actual as we have it, because it's always interwoven. It's always in the here with a perspective towards there, then other dimensions, other temporal and possibility dimensions. So it's very interesting. Yeah.
Perhaps the other thing to say is, which Fred reminded me of in what he was saying, but it's also contained in what I was saying, was that possibilities happen within a background of constraints, and that what really one feels with materials is their constraints, and the fewer constraints a material has, in a sense, the more possibilities there are. That would be an impression, but in fact that's an illusion. It's just that there's a certain amount of friction that one feels, or less friction. But I think the constraints are still there, and to a certain extent, there's also, I think, a generational thing going on here, where the two young people are very keen on possibilities. And but when I'm just sort of saying this just as a segue to the fact that it's my 60th birthday tomorrow. When you get to my age, I'm not including Fred in this, then a lot of possibilities have already happened, and what you concentrate on more and more is what is not possible, and or is no longer possible. And like, for example, I will never. I started my student life as a medical student, and I gave that up quite quickly, partly because I could see that it constrained possibilities enormously. If you were not a consultant by the time you were 40, then you were a bit of a failure. So basically, and most people, if they want to consultants, they become consultants. So I could see my life stretching out in front of me. But of course, I'm never going to go back to medical school now. I mean, that's just not possible. And there are a whole series of things that are no longer possible. And I think, but what's interesting about being 60 as opposed to 30 is that you've lived the possible life of a 30-year-old, and I'm now living the possible life of a 60-year-old. So there's a lot in between, and so that all these that one's perspective on possibility changes as life goes through, and what I'm going to claim is the wisdom of age is that we age nearly 60 have a hold on a lot of those, and that's also gives the impression about the illusory nature of possibility as well, because it changes so markedly.
It is very interesting to distinguish between the possible and the way we relate to it, and our perceptions and understanding of it. And yeah, it's a wonderful point about almost like the ontogenesis of the possible and the life course. But I mean, on the point of the impossible, Paul, and this is an idea that I want to throw out there and see how you guys react to it. So, when we think about the possible, we have two antinomies, and I know all of us are in the business of demolishing antinomies and maybe recreating them differently, but definitely challenging them. So one is between the actual and the possible, and that's where this microgenetic material-driven approach, I think, goes a very long way, and we might talk about more the vocabulary of how to do that to break down this dichotomy, and obviously something is both actual and possible at the same time in the moment, as it were. But then you have the possible and the impossible. And for many people, the impossible, right, is the opposite. And at least in my little theory, sociocultural theory of the possible, I place at the core of the possible the idea of difference and diversity, and possibility and alternatives. For me, a lot of what the possible is means alternatives. And the impossible, it strikes me, is also a perspective on things. I mean, it is a perspective that is constraining, but it is an alternative that never got to be or will never be, but that still invites dialogue around it. So I mean, the way you mentioned, right, you get to a point in life, and we all are at different points in life, and there are different circumstances where the impossible substantiates itself. But maybe in doing so, and maybe I'm romantic here, it does invite some other new possibilities around it just because it exists as an impossible. And for me, the actual opposite of the possible, I call it the non-possible out of lack of imagination. And it is a situation of Bakhtin would call it monologism. So there is no difference. There's nothing to talk about. There is no alternative perspective. So for me, the impossible is still an alternative, although it's kind of a dead alternative. I don't know even how to call it, but it can still invite dialogue. Call me out if I'm very romantic here about that.
When you invoke the concept of possibility, it necessarily invokes its opposite, and I think that's a potential. And I think that's why constraint is a better word as an opposite, because constraints are not. Constraints imply that something can happen within a framework. But I mean, we're exploring the idea of possibility, and I'm wondering when I'm on this moment with sculpting clay, and I'm in the present, and in the future is visible in the present. It doesn't. The concept of what is possible, I'm just, let's discuss it if you want, but it seems irrelevant to me because it's a bit like surfing a wave that all you can, if you stay on, that's great. And so you just have to be sensitive and aware to all the sensations, haptic, visual, particularly in to do with clay. Those are the two principal ones. Your main role is just to be sensitive to those. And so what does the concept of the possibility add to that? In that moment, I don't know, but I'm sort of asking. Maybe we can think about that. Maybe if you draw out and that there's an observer watching this, then they see what might be possible. And if I step out of that system, then I can start walking around this proto sculpture and think, I wonder what's possible with this. But within the system of making, it doesn't seem to me like possibility exists. I'll stop, otherwise I'll start to just burble.
Well, no, but I'm interested, just because of things that I've been doing this week, I'm interested then in whether you feel that's all making or just a very intense hand clay making. Because within that system, there's the clay and then there's Paul. But if you then bring in other things into the system, so I'm just thinking about work that I'm doing with someone that brings in tools where the discussions ongoing are, is this possible? Because the system is much more disjointed. Do you think that what you're describing as a system in which does collapse the possible in a way because it is something which is generalizable is not quite the right word, but something which is about the particular relationship and the particular feeling of clay? Or do you think it's something that's broader in the sort of, because you've obviously done work in other media as well?
Well, I think it's not a coincidence, I don't think, that this comes, and Lambros, who's my supervisor, part of the reason that he's supervising me and that I'm doing a DPhil with him is because of his interest in which human evolution, human biology, human culture intertwine and influence each other. And that works particularly well a plastic material like clay as an example. So yes, for sure. Although you do, I don't use tools very much with clay. Other ceramicists and artists use tools a lot more. But when I do use the example where when you do big works, then I use tools more. And there was one particularly big work that was more like a sort of plastering or rendering, and where I was using a rendering spatula. And what I found, as Merleau-Ponty used with the example of blind man, it just becomes part of your body. And so that the tool body distinction disappears if you become expert in its use. And before being expert, there's a sort of apprenticeship, but everyone can go through that apprenticeship. And by the time you're producing the sort of work that we're talking about, then you're an expert. And I think you could almost say that expert means that you lose the boundary between the tool and yourself, and that becomes just an integral part of the system. If you're when you're developing a way of working, whether you're using tools or not, and Wendy and Fred, you know about this because of the eye tracking flower stuff, and eye tracked me doing some work on some flowers, which was at the end of the first third of the process, where I was still developing the process, but it was sort of coming to the end. And there that sort of threw up this tension between developing a project, and then once the project is running, then it becomes incorporated, I would say, into a reasonably smooth running system that you could say from outside creates its own possibilities. From within side, you just run. It just runs. Does that make sense?
So in that case, would that moment have been where the possibilities were less sedimented, as it were? The moment. So there's the moment when the process, we describe the process, the moving and from the outside it might look possible, but from the inside there is the possibilities are erased at that point. It just is. But then before that, you discussed a moment where it wasn't sedimented, where it was, and I was thinking then some of the stuff that Vlad talks about, different perspectives or things quite not, or the tension and the things not quite working the way they should do, or things, is that maybe where the notion of the possible might come into play more than in the work that you do?
Yeah, I guess. Well, I guess what I say is that what happens is that all the material qualities, the anatomy of my hands, the gestural, let's call it gestural memory, experiences from other projects. These all come together. There's no option. I can't use a different hand anatomy. I can't use a different set of gestural memories. Those are the gestural memories and in a sense, the specific gestural memories are brought out by the qualities of the clay. So in a way, the system comes together because of what different elements of the system demand of other elements of the system. And so where is the possibility in that? When you're sitting in that system, it comes together, and it comes together in a bumpy way. But when you're outside that system, you can say, well, I mean, what about if you use a different sort of clay? Or what about if you go out and buy a spatula that is made of silicone and not... And those are possibilities within the system. The system, I would say, I mean, I don't want to be completely hardline about this, but because I think it's important to keep some uncertainty in it. But the system sort of constrains you to do that. The system is not working until you go to a shop, go and buy a spatula that is softer, and come back and start using it. Otherwise, it won't continue. And what won't it continue on? It won't continue on its line, on the line it has chosen. And it is the system that is choosing this line. The artist is part of it.
Can I interrupt and push you then? Because you've talked about then a stopping, and until you go to the shop and you buy this silicone spatula, the system won't continue. So I'm just pushing because it feels like there's a lot that's there. Something is happening that is so. When you describe a system, you personally have no agency of the system is, but there are points when the system stops and the system halts, and then there's a sort of an expansion then of different possibilities, because at the point, this is how it sounded to me, at the point when you need the soft silicone, although that's a point that you don't feel an agency, that's the thing that there also sounds to me like there's a tension and a constraint and a stopping of the smooth running. So is that where, if you go to the shop and that soft silicone thing isn't there, for example, whatever it might be, and you choose something else?
Yeah. That's why I'm saying it's important not to be hardline about this and be a bit fuzzy and unclear and uncertain at the edges, because what a lot of cognitive psychology is individualistic. And most of the time you read about the agent as an individual, and what I think we're all pushing to a certain extent, but maybe not, is the system as an agent. That this is systemic agency, but of course the system is delineated in some sense. I'm not talking about the whole universe. I'm talking about, for the sake of argument, the system of the workshop. So there are parameters outside of that that have the same sort of effect as I'm complaining about, when if you just take an individual and act as though they're an agent and the workshop doesn't have agency. Of course, there are other outside the workshop, and it's a good point that if I go to a shop and they don't happen to have the silicone or the silicone spatula, that they have something else, which I maybe hadn't even really conceived that could existed. And I think, oh, I buy that. That changes the rest of the system for the rest of its existence. And so that brings, and so that's something that sort of happens outside of the delineated system. But to a certain extent, this is all a bit constructed, because obviously if I go to a shop, then to a certain extent the system walks with me and reconfigures there. It's I read only a couple of days ago Sarah Pink. I don't know if you know the work of Sarah Pink. She wrote a book called Sensory Ethnography, and Visual Ethnography as well. Anyway, she talks about this concept of the ethnographic place, which isn't a place, which isn't a physical place. It's a sort of center of concentration, really. And I guess that's a bit what I'm talking about here, is that the center of concentration shifts from the workshop to the shop, and goes with it. But it leaves, the workshop doesn't disappear. There's strands left of the workshop as I cycle to the shop. And I think I may have answered a different question, or not even answered the question at all. What do you think?
Well,
everybody's waving their hands, so I think we'll let Fred wave his hands first. Everybody was doing this. Everyone has something to say, so go.
Well, to go back maybe to the antinomies that Vlad mentioned earlier, I'm listening to Paul, and of course it resonates a lot. And there's a sense that the possible as a dialogical process, certainly, and the dialogue as different scales, both in terms of its physicality and its temporality as well. So the system, the breadth of the system, and the complexity of the system that configures itself either at the tip of Paul's fingers or while he hops in the car and drives to the hardware shop. The system, and changes as well, and the possible is woven, I guess, at different speeds and on different scales, depending, of course, from at the granularity of the perspective you adopt to try to map or explain how the possible is realized in the production of a work of art, such as the one that Paul was describing. On the one hand, and that was also struck by, I think initially, Paul, you mentioned, that the flow-like element of, writing the surfer on the board and so forth. When you're manipulating the clay, you're manipulating the material. It's not clear then why the concept or how the concept of possible informs or is interesting in that. Partly because you're such in symbiosis as it was with. As you evolve and the clay evolves, you co-evolve together that way. And but yet as well, you said you can also, the system then expands, or it's a slightly different system when you can stand back, of course, and you have. And I know that some of the pieces that you've built are enormous, and I'm sure you've walked around them and poked them and prodded them and thought about different things you adopt a different perspective on it. So it's no longer, so if there's a flow here, it's a flow of a different type, possibly, certainly at a different scale, so there's an interesting sort of very dynamic changes in the granularity of that system, out of which I think the possible emerges.
It strikes me that, at least in the way I propose to think in dialogism and perspectives and so on, the notion of distanciation becomes important for our experience of the possible. And by the way, I think we can all agree here that we can distinguish between, a phenomenological, a kind of subjective experience of possibility or engaging with the possible in the moment, and perhaps an unfolding possible. And I don't want to create again a kind of a human non-human dichotomy, God forbid, especially with our group. But of course there are possibilities being acted upon as the clay and the hand move together that I think we can agree on. But whether Paul experiences that as the possible, it's a very fair question. And do you remember how distanciation? I mean that in order to see and perceive new possibilities, you need a bit of a symbolic, maybe material, physical distance as well. But then there is the other side of human life, which is immersion and flow. And I think Paul, beautifully talks to that side. And it's not void of possibility. And I was just thinking with myself here about monologism, right? Because I mentioned this idea of the uni perspective. And for me, when you acting is a monological moment, because when you do something, that all the other possibilities vanish in order to create a new zone of proximal development, if I'm to really borrow that term. So that not all possible vanishes, but to act means to close down certain things, for sure, right? But it's kind of the good monologism, and I'm going to explain myself in a moment, because what I mean by the non-possible and monologism as being really the antithesis of the possible is the denial of difference, is the almost a deliberate act of not accepting this diversity and difference. Well, I clearly don't think, and I think Paul would agree, this is not what's happening when the hand moves. I think for me, this monologism is exactly this micro level of interweaving action, immediate new possibilities, action, but they're in such a flow state that they're not perceived as these grand possibilities. But it is interesting for me how flow and immersion should be integrated and contribute to the story of the possible somehow. But it's definitely not an easy relation, as it is with reflection and wonder and standing back. It's much easier to put into that picture in the way I'm talking about it, of course.
Which is interesting because it implies that the possible requires exactly, because you've said all the way along, a difference of perspectives and grows up in difference. So if you have something like flow or immersion, then you don't have that difference. So so it sort of supports that aspect. I was brought to think of the adjacent possible, actually, when you talked then about the zone of proximal development, and that so the adjacent possible shifts constantly with what is around you, obviously because it's what's not possible in that moment, but a move will unveil that sort of circle of adjacent possible. So as your systems, because the systems that you're talking about, they have soft form boundaries, right? The boundaries are permeable. Sometimes it's not just on the level of analysis, but just on what's incorporated, because as you said, it's not the whole, well, it is. On a certain level of analysis, the entire universe is part of the system. But then on other levels of analysis, when we choose that level of, the way we look at it is permeable. And that to me, then, how the system's boundaries reform and change, and the system changes and reforms across time, and the points at which there's change and there's a reforming, that's always a bit that I find interesting. And that for me is where the possible can come up at the moment of the system's boundaries reforming, which may not be experienced in any way, but I think they can be observed from outside the system that you're in. But Fred, you were hand waving.
No, and I mean, I agree, and I would like to think as well that you've expressed more eloquently what I was trying to say. So thank you for that. But when I read again Vlad's sort of editorial / manifesto in EJOP and leading up to this meeting this morning, and I want to go back maybe to some of the things earlier about it being illusory. And I think what strikes me, and I think what certainly I and perhaps another naive reader, when reading about possibilities or the possible, it could be taken, and I mean, of course, no disrespect here, as some kind of pixie dust, some kind of magical thing, and yet from a more grounded, terrible term, but psychological perspective, trying to understand in terms of processes and mechanism how new things appear, so how the possible is woven. What's inescapable here is work, and hence there are notions of instrumentality. You talk about differences, different perspectives, and so forth. Sometimes I fear that the language is too passive. That these different perspectives will sort of crash onto your shore, as opposed to you also trying to engage. And I certainly, in Wendy's recent experience, looking at artists and you're thinking of Paul, and maybe again more parochially when you think about ourselves as scholars and researchers, the possible is only possible through work. Now, if you think of work in terms of the sort of the handicraft that's required to make the possible happen, then that also invites, I think from my perspective, an interesting research agenda to better understand that work and to map that work. So to me, what's quite inspiring about possibilities, or the notion of the possible, is it's clearly its materiality, but also how it proceeds through different stages of labor, as it was. That's a terrible metaphor. It sounds like you're giving birth to something. But that I've drawn inspiration from that perspective of some years, and in part because of Vlad and Paul and Wendy and so forth the last few years. I think that describing that work goes a long way in explaining how the possible is woven.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that. By that, Fred, or ask you to clarify. By that, Fred, I think, are you meaning by this work, by concentrating on visible changes that can be recorded, and in your, in the case of your work, that you change the focus from constructions of models of internal cognitive activity to...
My feeling is a much more fruitful perspective on this, because if you forefront the work, the labor, the instrumentality that's required in actualizing the possible, then I think that there's a natural deflection away from focusing on the person, and then it becomes, and there's a number of interesting and challenging methodological consequences of adopting that perspective, because then for example, even though I still label myself as an experimentalist, then certainly in my recent experience collaborating with Wendy and with you, Paul, then I think, well, then I need to be much more of an ethnographer. I need to be much more granular and much more descriptive. And I'm still trying to not just make my peace with this. I think I've made my peace with that, but also personally, from a professional perspective, how I juxtapose my work and with what experimentalists and what more traditional quote unquote cognitive scientists would make of that, because of, and you mentioned individualism and a more sort of systemic perspective on agency and intentionality, and I would of course argue, as you would, a more systemic perspective on creativity.
One of the things that I think maybe makes the work, the sort of experimental work, interesting and different in terms of where the possible is with that. And I was thinking that this morning. And I think there's an art to running an experiment. And I think that you create an experiment in the same way. It's very different art, but it's still an art, and it's still a creative, the creation of an experiment is itself a creative act. And it goes well. It's so beautiful. I mean, there's some of the most beautiful, elegant, wonderful experiments that you can see. And again, like with all art, you have to understand the experimentation to understand how beautiful those things are. So because very few people have those double appreciations, it's actually quite rare to view. But I see no reason why an experiment isn't an art form, and creating one and running one isn't an art form. And one of the things that I was reflecting on is some work that Fred and I are doing, where we're trying to get the stimuli right. And we've been doing it now for 6 weeks, and it keeps just going wrong. But what we do, which is perhaps different, is that we send it out into the world and we see what happens. And then we bring it back and we go, oh, that didn't work. And so the possible is then constrained by the people so the system then becomes a very different system in that act of creating, in that act of refining and moving, and the recursive backwards and forwards, and that dance between what we're creating there, and then what and what's interesting there is, so you have these wonderful what if conversations, which are very, very, very possible conversations. What if we do this, that, or the other? We just did one where we thought we were trying to code the things in the same place. What if we do this? This is great. We definitely agree. Oh no, our agreement rate's like 30%. So we hit against a thing there. So then we start back and we go back, and it's that is beautiful and underexplored and under researched. So I don't think you should throw away experimental psychology because that, but you can learn so much about what's possible then, because you're sending it out into a different sort of world, and that then constrains the possibility of what they're trying to do.
Yeah. No, I just want to come in just one moment to say how much I appreciate this regrounding or grounding of the possible in human activity. And experimentation is one type of activity, art making is an activity, and there might be many more intersections between them than we imagine. I mean, I often go back to Dewey's text on art as experience, where for him, the experience is not just of creating art. You know, that every experience of life has this almost aesthetic quality to it, and experimentation definitely is one of those. And if we talk about action and activity, I mean, there's so many things we can talk about. For instance, how it is constrained culturally, how it is placed within the life course. You know, we picked up on some of these things. But at the end of the day, if we strip it down, and I don't want to oversimplify, of course, but there is an element of what we put into the world, maybe intentionality, maybe that's a bit of a narrow term, maybe it's an orientation towards the world somehow. Dewey would call it the doing, right? Exactly the what you do. And there's an element of receiving from the world something, a kind of a reaction to your action, which Dewey called the undergoing. So in a way, that is the cycle that opens and closes up possibilities constantly. And it does so across domains somehow.
That was really what I felt like we send these things off full of hope. There's always hope, and at that point you're almost in a suspended possible. So you don't know, you have no idea what's going to come back. And you hope, and the range then at that point, when you craft this thing and you send it out, and you have everything from a file drawed experiment right up to a science paper, right? All in the possible on what's going to come out there. And you really hope that it's the science paper, but you think it's probably the file draw, right? And it's there, and there's a suspended possible, which is beautiful. And then in comes a set of Excel spreadsheets, and all of a sudden something is changed. And I like that moment. And I think that if you talk to an experimentalist, that's the moment that's the best. That's the best moment. That's why you do it. So yeah, that's just what I thought you were talking about, what you do as that engagement with the possible, but that then requires, exactly as you said, sending it out and getting feedback, and then your possible then being constrained and by what happens.
Yeah, I think what Fred and Wendy you're doing with experiments, and this is what I'm going to try and describe what I think you're doing with experiments, what's good about what you're doing, and then I want to try and encourage you to do something which is more of that. But to take the triangle of coins experiment as an example, which we all know about, but I better just summarize it very, very quickly somehow for people who don't. Basically, there's a psychology experiment in which people are given a problem to solve. They have to turn around a triangle which is made of a number of coins, and they have to do it in a number of moves in time. And most often this is done, people are asked to do this in their head, and sometimes they're asked to do it in the world. But Fred and Wendy developed this experiment where it was done in the world and done on a pad, on a computer, so that each move could be recorded. And so there's videos of people solving this, and then there's the move parts, which the way the coins are moved. And the point, all that to say, the point I wanted to make is that in experiments, when you write them out, the materiality of experiments is almost left out of the write-up. And here, what you do is you see the video of some hands and some moves that the focus takes the person out of, so takes the individual out. The experiment takes the individual out and puts the process in, and this is one of the wonders of this experiment, is that just its construction means that you deconstruct individualism. And the experimental procedure and construction constrains us to look at the process as it happens, and that in itself. And then, of course, you know, if you were writing this up in a traditional way, you'd leave all that out, and you wouldn't, and you would rewrite it towards a more well, I guess, you know, cognitive experimental sort of discourse. But what I'm sort of wanting to happen, which is what is happening with the two of you, is that this materiality of the experiment is made part of the discourse. And that both then supports the argument of how the problem solving was systemic, but also how the art of the experiment is part of this process. And this is what happened. It's been for a long time part of the process in art, and this is something that I think science could learn from art, is about how to include. And to a certain extent, that's what happens in ethnography. I mean this has been over, I don't know, at least 20 years, the sort of process of change in ethnography. But I don't think experiments need to change in quite this. You don't need to become ethnographists to do this with experiments. There are different things happening with experiments than there are with ethnography that also underline this, and it's those things that are special to experiments that are important to keep.
Well, I would just want to say thank you to Fred and Paul for giving up their morning to come and talk to us about this, and to help. Well, it certainly helped me think through some of my ideas about what the possible means when it's materially engaged, and to what extent it is possible when you're in flow and immersion. And whether there's a sense in which the possible really does need this disconnect between perspectives, or not even disconnect, but it needs to have separate perspectives that are also engaged but keep their separation. And I'm reminded very much of the smoothie metaphor, Vlad. You do the smoothie metaphor better than me, so you may want to take over and discuss that. But that was one of the first metaphors you ever used. So for me, so go.
Which metaphor did I use? Sorry.
The smoothie metaphor.
Oh yes, the smoothie. Well, one of my favorites, just like smoothies. Yes. if we want a fruit basket, if we want a fruit salad, or if we want a smoothie, and it's best, I mean, I'm just recommending everyone with their own, but to have the fruit salad, because you still have the fruits separate, but they all come together in a way. Don't just lose the fruits together, and when you have no distinction, there's very little to grab onto and to create more out of, in a way, right? But when you keep things too separate, there is no dialogue. So yeah, here we go. A fruit salad for everyone at the end.
And fruit salad requires work, right? You have to peel the fruit, and you have to, so it ties in with what Fred was saying. It doesn't just appear, it requires work and things. In a real fruit salad, you don't want like the bananas at the bottom because they get too squishy. So you have to really think through how you organize it all.
Here we wrap it up completely. Exactly. Activity, human action. But for me, I mean, it was wonderful. And thank you so much for accepting our invitation and talking to us, because for me, it really revealed once more the idea of levels almost of analysis and of the possible, and the way the micro and the onto and the macro, kind of show us a difference, almost like a different phenomenon at some level. And yet, I do believe there is a strong kernel there. And we've been discussing that, right? There's something that has to do with doing and undergoing, with kind of immersion and detachment, and there, even in the micro, you have different kind of, it's almost like an accordion. Maybe we should talk about the accordion model of the possible. Just came to mind right now. Kind of going, expanding and contracting somehow, hopefully delivering some beautiful music in the process. But looking at these different levels and what cuts across them, I think would be a wonderful kind of thing to discuss further. Yeah.
Fred, what did you get out of this morning?
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's always a joy to discuss these things with you, and both in listening to your reactions and also me articulating some of these thoughts. The dialogical aspect of the possible and its enactment is important. Clearly, and again, from a personal perspective, mapping out the process, this dialogical process, and the materiality of the process, of course, but also of the different sort of phases or stages of the possible as it's created, become interesting objects of study as well, yeah, to me at this stage, it seems like an endless source of inspiration.
Yeah, I wanted to just underline that I find a particular corner And so it sounds like the corner that I was fighting was that the experience of possibility doesn't really exist on this wave of doing. So I just wanted to put right that doesn't mean that that if you take a different perspective, that possibilities aren't experienced and can't be directly experienced. And so I'm not saying that possibilities is not an experiential thing. It's just that Vlad, you will understand this, I'm sure. It depends on a shift in perspectives. And all of these, and I'm also not against an individual approach. I mean, the concept of self is important to everyone, and there's a lot of study that goes on about that. And it's not that I'm criticizing that in particular. It's just that there's loads of that going on, and so that's fine. It's being dealt with. We don't need to concern ourselves with that. But there's at the more macro level and at the more micro level, I think there are gaps, and that's what I think we're trying to cover between the four of us.
And I think we're doing a super job of it. Thank you very much. And we do have the conference, so the links to that will be on the YouTube channel anyway, so do feel free to come along and register if you found this conversation interesting.
The conference is 10th to 13th of May 2021, depending when you're going to watch this video, and it's going to be an online event, and very much open to everyone interested in human possibility, the impossible, materiality, and the rest.
There'll be an opportunity to talk about these concepts in breakout rooms and things like that over the whole course of the conference. So do please make sure that you register and attend.